Thank you, Nadia, for that introduction. We really are so grateful to have Dr. Amador with us today. So welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
We had the opportunity to have you on a Hope for Mental Health community about a year and a half ago, but this is the first time that I've got to introduce you to our Breathe parents. And let me tell you, they are excited to have you with us. And I think the reason is because probably the number one question that I have when I'm talking to other parents, or the complaint or the frustration that I hear from so many parents, is this very thing that is your life work, which is my loved one, my child, and these are typically parents, my child does not understand that he or she is ill, or my son or daughter doesn't understand the depth of their illness. They think everybody else is the problem. If everybody else would just get off their back, just leave them alone, just everybody else fall into line, that everything would be fine. And they are just, you're starting to talk to a group of parents who are weary and frustrated and maybe have estranged relationships with their kids because of this ongoing, arguments and frustration and inability to communicate. They don't know what to do next. And so the reason I'm so thrilled that you are here is because you have dedicated your life's work to these parents and to the individuals who are living themselves without an awareness of that. But tell us how that came to be. How did this come to be your life work?
Yeah, it's a great question. Where it started for me is a very personal place. I immigrated from Cuba right after the revolution, and my father had been killed in the revolution. My mother and my siblings and I all ended up in Ohio, and that's a long story, more time than we have. Why Ohio instead of Florida? And
that is an interesting question, but anyway.
Yeah, for another time.
Yes, a third interview, we'll talk about that.
Okay, but my brother Henry, 8 years older than me, was really my rock in a lot of different ways. He was a father figure as well as an older brother, and we were very, very close. He really was my best friend growing up, and years later, after we got through all the arguing about whether he was mentally ill or not, he was my best friend again. But what happened was, growing up, like I said, he was really someone that I looked up to, and someone who really listened to me and cared about my experience and was very supportive. Taught me how to ride a bicycle, throw a baseball. Taught me how to drive. He was just always there for me. And when I got into my early 20s and he was in his late 20s, he called me one day. I was in New York. I was in college studying psychology. And Henry called me from Arizona, where he was living with my mother and my stepfather. My mother had remarried a wonderful man who I call Dad. And Henry called me in New York from Arizona and said, Javi, that's my family nickname, Javi, come home quick. I killed Dad. Hung up the phone. I didn't for a second think that he had harmed our stepfather. But I knew something was, terribly amiss. So I got him back on the phone. And he proceeded to describe how he had killed our father, how he believed he had. It was all delusion, that he had been playing the guitar, the music got transmitted into our father's head, causing him to trip and fall and hit his head. And obviously that's not what happened. I flew home and to Arizona, and my siblings, our blended family was like the mega Brady Bunch. There were 9 of us. And it was actually a lot of fun growing up with everybody. And he was in his bedroom, Henry was isolating, and my 7 other siblings and I were in the living room, and they all basically pointed at me and said, "You deal with Henry, you're the psychologist." I didn't like that phrase, "you deal with him," but everybody was very distraught and upset. And Henry was acting very strange. He was hearing voices. He had other delusions. He thought our mother was the devil. Her eyes were laser beams. Really bizarre ideas. And I think the reason that they recruited me really wasn't because I was a psychologist, because I wasn't a psychologist. I was a senior in college. Was because of the relationship Henry and I had growing up. And we were very, very close. So I went and I talked to my brother. And like a lot of the families that are going to be listening to us, watching us, I had the experience of him saying, "There's nothing wrong. I'm not sick. I don't need any help." And the experience of me trying to convince him that he had a mental illness, that something was terribly wrong, and we needed to go see a psychiatrist. Took me a week to get him into the hospital. Yeah. And it didn't go as well as I hoped it would go. I had to call the police. He was suicidal and talking about killing himself because of his guilt, his delusional belief that he had killed our father. Police were fantastic, actually. This is long before we had crisis intervention trained police officers, CIT. But these guys were great. Got him to the hospital. He got treatment. He got an antipsychotic medication. And I was just amazed, really, about the change that occurred very quickly. The hallucinations disappeared. The delusions became very muted. He was in the hospital, if you can believe this, for a month. This is way back in 19...
Unheard of.
I know. Today it's,
Yeah.
72 hours. 1981. And he and I were at a discharge meeting. He was ready to leave the hospital. And the psychiatrist explained to him and to me that he had schizophrenia, that he'd need to take the medication he was on for the rest of his life. Now, as far as I was concerned, that was kind of good news. I mean, the schizophrenia was a scary diagnosis, but the medication really helped him.
Yeah.
So he said, yes, I agree. I understand. We went home. My mom made dinner. We had dinner together. He went back into his room. I'm doing the dishes. And as I, throw some trash into the trash bin under the sink, what do you think I found? His bottle of medication. So only hours after this meeting with the psychiatrist. So I fished it out, and I knocked on his door, and I brandished the bottle, and in an accusatory way, and I said, "Why aren't you taking this? Why is this in the garbage?" And he said, "Well, I don't need it." I said, "Henry, just 4 hours ago, you said you understood you have schizophrenia, you have a very serious mental illness, and that you needed to take this medication." And he said, "Well, that was then. This is now. I'm better now." That started a 7-year period, 7 years, where I first gently, and then other times, frankly, I was pretty angry. We argued. I kept telling him he needed help. He kept saying, "I don't need help." I never called him crazy, but he used to, and I know people, listening to us have heard this. He said to me, "You're the crazy one, not me." I never used that term. And for those 7 years, our relationship, was terrible. We fought a lot. I was accusing him of being stubborn and immature and insensitive to our mother and all that she had been through, and losing 2 husbands, and tried to make him feel guilty. And I'm not proud of anything that I'm telling you right now, but it's a very common experience I've encountered with, countless families I've worked with. And he had about 4 hospitalizations a year. He wasn't able to work. He wasn't able to go back to school. It was really headed downhill. Yeah. And during that time, I was actually being trained to be a psychologist, and I was working with a woman on an inpatient psychiatric ward who was just like my brother. She had a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder. Her mother had called the police, actually, and he had been brought in. She had been brought in. She wanted no part of what I was offering, medication, treatment, discharge from the hospital to an outpatient clinic. And I was frustrated, probably because it reminded me of what was happening with my brother Henry at the time. So I went and talked with my supervisor, telling him the same story I'm telling you about this woman. And he puts his hands up and he says, "Javier, stop talking." And I said, "Okay." He says, No. Stop talking to her. Start listening. Right? Ask her, what does she want? Work with her on her goals. And you can't find out her goals without asking her first. So I went back out and met with her, and I apologized for, going through my checklist and telling her what her problem was. I said, "Let's start over. What do you want?" And big surprise, she said, "I want to get out of the hospital." I said, "Okay, what else?" And she said, "I want my mother to stop calling the police on me." I said, "Okay, let's work on those goals." And within just a few days, she was able to accept medication. She agreed to work with me in an outpatient clinic for a year. This was my internship year, my last year in my PhD program. And I had an epiphany. I thought, wow, this is what I've been doing to my brother. I've not been listening. I've been telling him what the problem was. I've been telling him that he needed to take medication. So I called Henry, And he was still in Arizona living with my mom. I was in New York. And I said a couple of things, really important things in retrospect. I said, first and foremost, that I'm sorry for all the times I told you you were mentally ill. I'll never do it again. And I kept that promise. I never again told him he had a mental illness. I promise I'll never tell you you need to take medication. I'll never do it again. And I never did. Within 6 months of this pretty radical shift, I mean, think about it. You know, what's the common sense thing to do, right? Your loved one is seriously ill, and of course you're going to tell them they've got a problem. Of course you're going to tell them they need help. But I stopped doing that. And within 6 months of that conversation, and many others that followed like it, where we talked about what he wanted, what he believed he needed, and I respected that, he accepted medication, not any medication. In fact, it was a long-acting injectable medication. So he'd go in for an appointment, get an injection, and he recovered. No more hospitalizations for the rest of his life. For almost 20 years, he lived.
Wow.
He died in a car accident, which wasn't his fault. It's worth actually telling that story briefly, but let me give you the highlights of what I was talking about. He had 2 volunteer jobs. He had a girlfriend. He went to a clubhouse, and if people don't know what that is, that's where people gather who have mental illness and have, you know, activity.
We'll put the link to that in the note, so people
Such an important resource.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, really is. But you know what he said about it? He said, I really like going and hanging out with those mentally ill people. He never saw himself as mentally ill, ever. And I asked him once, you know, giving talks and about my research, I would talk about Henry, and I said, you know, I often get the question, do you think you have schizophrenia? What do you think? This is a conversation I had with him a year before he passed. And he says, no, I don't have schizophrenia. And then I asked him, well, why are you taking the medication? Why are you taking antipsychotic medication if you don't have schizophrenia? And he said, well, I do it for you and for mom and pops. Now, mom and pops are Betty and James. They ran the home that he lived in, the supported living arrangement. So what's his answer? Not because he's mentally ill. He did it for relationships.
Wow.
And now, when he was ill, I thought he was very selfish. When he was ill and we were arguing those 7 years, I thought he was immature, irresponsible, uncaring with our mother. And I'm going to tell you how he died, actually, because it really is a stark reminder of how I lost sight of my brother during those years that I was trying to convince him he was ill, and we fought. He had been gone to the clubhouse, had come back from his volunteer job, was getting on a bus, and he was on the bus and noticed a woman on the sidewalk struggling with groceries. So he stepped off and handed her groceries, when somebody who had been not managing his diabetes well had a diabetic episode and drove onto the sidewalk. So how did my brother die? Being my brother, being Henry, you know, kind. He was being a good Samaritan, right? He was being a good Samaritan. So I really had lost sight of who he was during those 7 years, that I kept telling him what he needed to do instead of asking him what he wanted to do and working with him on his goals, and stopping. This is really important. And it was the foundation of the research that I did for over 20 years. Not telling him he needed to take medication, not telling him he had mental illness. And as we talk further, maybe I can explain how that works. Because
yes.
If you're not telling the person they need treatment, how can you help them decide to accept treatment? There's a whole approach that my colleagues and I developed that works to do exactly that.
Well, and that's
a long answer. It's a long answer to your question. Sorry.
No. I think it's a beautiful answer to the question. It's tender, it's poignant, it's relatable to probably everybody listening, because, as I said, it is this, or some variation of this, is probably one of the greatest frustrations that parents experience, is not being able to be on the same page with their loved one about treatment, medication, and whether they're ill or not, and then how they respond to that. So it's so common. I know the parents are completely identifying with this, and I loved even that you bring in that part about just about the way that Henry died, because as you said, it's very easy to lose sight. Mental illness is a thief and a robber, and it can rob us of seeing the beauty and the goodness and the essential kindness of our loved ones.
Yeah.
And we get caught in a very ugly, frustrating, painful web that most people don't know really how to get out of. And so the method that you and your colleagues have developed, you call it the LEAP method or the LEAP approach, and you have the LEAP Institute. And you just told us how applying those principles transformed your relationship with your brother. And so I think one of the best things you can do for us is just to, in the time that we have, go deep, as much as you can into explaining what is the LEAP approach and how does it offer the potential for transforming our relationships.
Well, in the research we've done and my experience, working with countless families, I mean, thousands of families over the years, suggests it works much more often than not. But before I talk about it, let me take a step back and talk about the nature of the problem.
Great.
What my brother had was a symptom. It wasn't denial. It wasn't stubbornness or immaturity or selfishness. It wasn't a coping strategy. It was a symptom of the illness, just like hallucinations or delusions. And the symptom is a tongue twister. I didn't name it. It was named by a neurologist in 1919, describing stroke patients who were paralyzed, and they didn't know they were paralyzed. And it's called anosognosia. It's a tongue twister.
Yeah, I've had to practice a lot to get that word to roll off easily.
I always think of a woman named Anne who knows eggs. Anosognosia. Anyway, that's how I learned it.
Yes.
But so when you understand, when people hear me talk about it, and this is a function of dysfunction, of deficits in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. They sometimes lose hope, like, well, geez, if my loved one, my son or daughter, will never understand they have an illness, then what can I do? There's a lot you can do. That story I told about that woman I worked with is the foundation of what we can do, which is stop arguing, stop trying to educate, and instead start rebuilding a relationship.
Can I pause and ask you, just as you were talking about anosognosia, how common is it? Probably a lot of these parents don't know exactly how common it is in certain illnesses.
50% of all people with schizophrenia, schizoaffective, and bipolar disorder, one half. It's the most common symptom in these psychotic illnesses. The most common symptom, more common than hallucinations.
Wow.
So 50%. And there's a couple hundred studies now that have found that over and over and over again, that rate. So what do you do if somebody has, I wouldn't tell someone to stop hallucinating, would you?
No.
Just cut it out.
Just stop.
Your hallucinations are really hurting mom. Just, stop hallucinating. No, but that's what I was doing with respect to his lack of awareness. Just cut it out. In our circumstance, in our family, it was just very painful for our mother, and he was living with her. And so, I started to try to operationalize. In other words, take the success I'd had with him and the success I'd had with patients I worked with in my training, and together with Dr. Aaron Beck, some people may know who he is. He was the father of cognitive psychology. We had a grant to do an inpatient psychotherapy. And what I realized, and with Dr. Beck's blessing, I lifted out of that therapy a communication approach. So LEAP stands for listen, empathize, agree, and partner. Those are 4 of 7 tools. There's 3 other tools, which I'll touch on in a moment. But listening isn't just do you really need another psychologist to tell you listening is valuable? No. But LEAP listening is very different. It's very active. So, Kay, if you told me, let's say you had bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, and you told me nothing's wrong with me, the reason I haven't worked in 5 years is because the CIA I would reflect that back actively. So, Kay, hold on, let me see if I understand. You haven't worked because the CIA has interfered with your ability to work. Is that correct? And you're going to say yes. Now, you might ask me, so do you believe me? And that's where we have 3 other tools. We delay giving certain opinions, if we can delay without frustrating. And then we give our opinion in a very humble way. And I'll give an example of that in a moment. We also apologize for things that we've said or done that were hurtful to the person. So there are 7 tools: listen, empathize, agree, partner, delay giving hurtful opinions, give our opinion in a very humble way, and apologize for things that were hurtful. So with leap reflective listening, people get scared of it because they think, well, how can I reflect back to someone that, the CIA is
Right.
interfering with their life?
Right.
I'm not saying I agree. I'm not saying I believe you. That's correct. What I'm saying is, let me see if I understand. So you preface what you're going to reflect back. Let me see if I understand. Let me see if I got this right. The CIA has interfered with your ability to find work. And then you ask the person, did I understand you? So it's active, reflective listening. We teach this to family members. We teach this to mental health professionals. We teach this to law enforcement. It's a way of really quickly calming someone down. And especially if you've been in this conflict that I found myself in with my brother, it really starts to mend the wounds and rebuild a relationship. And then you empathize in a very particular way.
I want to ask you a question, but I want to let you maybe get all the way through the basic and then come back, or what do you think?
Ask me a question. Let's make this
Ask
a
the question.
conversation.
Okay. Well,
I could talk all night about this. So,
well, it's fascinating. I want to hear it all night. That's just counterintuitive.
Yeah,
Completely
Yeah.
and utterly counterintuitive.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of, well, here's my question. Does that come easier? Does the ability to be a reflective listener come easier to some people than to others?
Yes, although you'd be surprised when I'm training mental health professionals who have been trained to use reflective listening, and we do a role play exercise, they find it really hard to do it in the way that we teach it. Because, there's 3 elements. You preface with, let me see if I understand. You reflect back. So what you're saying is that Dad and I, let's say I'm a mother, have been poisoning you. Is that right? Right? I mean, that's really counterintuitive. Like, why are you talking about that? And let me say 2 things.
Yeah.
Let me say 2 things. Delusions are fixed false beliefs by definition. So I'm not going to make someone's fixed false belief worse by listening and actively, validating their experience.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, and the other thing that will help people to consider doing this kind of thing is, it's a question I often ask, is, for how many years have you been telling your son or daughter that they have a problem and they need help? And the answers I get are, a year, 6 years, 15
Absolutely.
years. And then my next question is, did it work?
Yeah.
No. Yeah. So what's Einstein's definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result.
A different outcome. Yeah.
So that helps people kind of do this.
I just feels like there's, let me put myself in here. I know that after I read your book and, learned so much more about the LEAP method and all that, I wished that I could go back and have conversations with my son who, died in 2013.
Sorry.
Thank you. Because I can think of this so many times that he was not exactly delusional, but he just had some bizarre ideas. I don't know, schizophrenia or schizoaffective was not ever part of his diagnosis, but he had some really odd ideas that he was very rigid and holding onto and demanding or thinking that this should be this way. And he could say, like, one of his was, well, God, if you say he's all powerful, this is the conversation that we had repeatedly. If you say God is all powerful, then he should be able to come sit on this couch and explain to me why my life is this hard. He's got the power. He can do that, right, Mom? He can do anything. And then I would feel that I was backed into this corner of like, well, because my belief system told me, yes, I do believe God is all powerful. So, but is he going to do that? No. Even if he could, he's not going to. But so there would be this repetitive. And I found that something in me also has a bit of rigidity, and I wanted to get to reality. And I kept thinking that reality would be helpful if he could understand that God wasn't going to do that.
Right.
Or if I could somehow say it differently this time than I said it last time, that somehow that would make the difference. And so I'm just wondering if there aren't people whose personality is a little less rigid, little less
Mhm.
black and white thinking, if they might have an easier time grabbing on to this reflective listening, or maybe it's just not as hard as I'm thinking it is if I had had the kind of instruction that you offer.
Well, it's hard to do it first.
Mm.
What I have found is most people can do it, but they have to first recognize their powerlessness, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I did that, dialogue. I played both parts of, has it worked? You've tried for how many years and it hasn't worked? Why are you still trying it that way?
Right.
Once you recognize your powerlessness over this symptom of anosognosia, this inability for your son or daughter to see what we see, once you recognize that that's a symptom of the brain disorder, and that you failed to educate, to bring reality into the picture for the person, then you can sort of take a exhale and say, I need to do something different.
Well, it's just so important that you said it's not by listening. I think some people might also have the idea. I know you talk about how we need to know our fears as we're going to do this reflective listening. And one of the fears would be, won't I be reinforcing it? Won't I make it worse? Won't I make him or her think that I can fix the making God come sit on the couch, or
Right.
the CIA stop poisoning your food, or whatever.
Well, that's when we give our opinion. We call it the 3 A's. You apologize for what you're going to say. You acknowledge that you could be wrong, and you ask the person to agree to disagree. So if I was talking to your son, I'd reflect it back first. So what you're asking me is, if God's all powerful, why doesn't he come here and explain to you why your life is the way it is? Did I get that right? And he's going to say yes. And well, what do you think, Mom? Do you agree with me? Well, I'm really sorry. This is the 3 A's. I'm really sorry. And I could be wrong about this. I don't think that's the way God works. And I hope we don't have to argue. I hope we can agree to disagree. So it's giving our opinions in a humble way where we acknowledge we don't know everything, that we're not the arbiters of reality, to allow that our loved one's reality to be respected and not judged. But we're going to say what we think. Yeah, that's part of the LEAP approach. We do give our opinions, but we do it in this softer, gentler way.
You also talk about delaying it, and maybe you'll come back to that, but it's I think many of us are so interested in giving our opinion really quickly.
Right.
And you actually advise against that.
Yeah.
And like I said, you may want to come back to that, but I just want our audience to know there is a place for that, but it's not right at the start.
Well, it can be, though, actually.
It can. Okay.
Yeah, here's the thing about LEAP. People think these are steps. First we listen, then we empathize, then we look for areas where we agree, and that's what we partner on. These are 7 tools. And then delaying, giving your opinion, giving it in the way that I described, apologizing, the 7 tools. Imagine a tool belt, 7 empty pockets. You might use reflective listening in a conversation. You may be asked to give your opinion, so you might want to delay. And why delay? Because when we give our contrary opinion, I don't think it works that way, or I think you have a mental illness, or I think you need treatment, it's going to injure the relationship. And LEAP is all about rebuilding and strengthening the relationship. So you delay by saying, I promise I'll answer your question about whether the devil has taken over me. I mean, you can talk about delusions that involve you.
Yeah.
But before I do, could I ask you to tell me more about, and then you ask the person to talk about something that's important to them. And then you ask permission to delay. I promise I'll answer your question about this, the devil has taken over me and has replaced me. Before I do, can you tell me more about when you first noticed this? And then you ask permission, would that be okay?
Hmm.
And then what's the point of that? We want our opinion to be one that's been asked for, not just rushing out and getting it. So when we delay, we create that kind of dialogue with the person where they're asking, well, you told me you'd tell me, why don't you tell me? We want our opinion to be a solicited opinion. And the other reason to oftentimes delay giving these kinds of opinions, do you think I'm mentally ill? I promise I'll answer that question. Before I do, can you tell me a little bit about, or can we talk about what happened this morning with the dog? Would that be okay? What we're also doing is creating more opportunity for listening and empathizing with the person before we say something that's going to upset them.
Yeah. So keep talking. What is it that, what do we need to empathize with in particular?
Especially feelings that come from delusions, if your loved one has delusions, because these are ideas, these irrational ideas that most people don't want to talk about. Most people, when they hear them, kind of, cringe.
They make us uncomfortable.
And exactly. So it leaves, the people with mental illness who don't know they have mental illness, who have the symptom of anosognosia, are, in my experience, the loneliest people I've ever met. Really lonely. Everyone around them doesn't believe what they believe, tells them they're sick. Everyone around them. So being empathic with those feelings. So if somebody's very fearful or angry or elated by their delusional beliefs, I want to empathize with that. So God chose you to be the new Messiah. Is that right? Did I understand that correctly? Yes, I've done reflective listening. Well, how does that feel? I feel very blessed. I feel very lucky. I feel all powerful. If I was in this is the empathy part. If I was in your shoes, I'd feel all powerful too. Am I making the delusion worse? No. Delusions are fixed false beliefs. We can't make them worse. What I am making better is my loved one feeling heard, understood, validated. So we normalize the feelings by saying things like, anybody would feel the way you're feeling.
Because typically our approach alienates, and what you're suggesting actually creates connection.
Yes, exactly. And trust.
Yeah.
And trust that the person won't be judged. And then you look for areas where you agree. That's the A in the LEAP acronym. We're never going to agree if the person has anosognosia. It tends to be a stable, long-lasting symptom, by the way. So we're very likely never going to agree that the person has a mental health condition, a mental illness, or they need to take medication for that reason. There's other reasons we can help people decide to take medication for. So we're not going to agree on those things, but we could agree on things like staying out of the hospital, finding a job, not arguing anymore, having peace in the home. There's all kinds of things we can agree on. And that's what we partner on, those things. So my brother wanted pocket money. That's what he called it, $5 a day. I was like, I want to give that to you, Henry. I'll give that to you, but I need you to do something for me. It's like, what? I said, go and get these injections of medicine. Now, I didn't tell him he needed it. I said, do it for me. He got really angry. He said, you're my little brother, and who are you? And you're making money, and you're a psychologist, and just give me the money. I said, Henry, I want to give you the money. I really do. And I'm so sorry. This is what I need in order to give you the money. And it took about 6 months of that conversation. And he eventually, I sent him $5 for 18 years every day.
Wow. And
for 18 years, he went for the injections and took the medication. And for 18 years, he was not symptomatic, recovering, had relationships, friendships, work, a girlfriend. The power of relationships can't be overstated. Where someone feels loved and not judged, and that I'm their ally, that's what leads people to treatment. That's what you can partner on.
It sounds to me like the very first step, you can tell me if I'm wrong, is changing your goal.
Yes. Well said.
Changing the goal that you have as a parent.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's radical.
Yeah. From trying to convince your loved one they're ill and need help to, I'm going to befriend my child. I'll always be a parent, but my child is an adult now, and I can also be their friend. So that's the goal, is to help your loved one, your child, your adult child, feel heard, listened to, understood, empathized with, and that you're on their side. Then you can start to ask them to do things. Maybe this will help you with sleep. You've been up all night worried about the FBI and the CIA bugs. Why don't would you consider seeing someone? I found this doctor might be able to help you sleep at night. I mean, that's just one of many examples I could give of things you can agree on and partner on.
Yeah, because it sounds like it is the absolute lost cause of all lost causes to have as your goal to persuade your loved one to acknowledge that they have an illness, or that they are as sick as you think they are, or as everybody else, thinks they are, that is just a lost cause that needs to be let go of.
Yes.
If we really want to help our child, we have to begin, because they're not going to be the ones starting this transformation.
Right.
It is dependent upon us letting go of a lost cause. As you've said, it hasn't worked so far. The likelihood of it working tomorrow or next week or next year is practically nil, unless some miraculous something happens, and that's probably not going to happen either. And so we can either choose to keep butting our head against the brick wall and end up bloody and weary and alienated, or we can let that go. Start over with a completely different agenda and learn about building the relationship, rather than getting our loved one to say, I'm sick and I need help.
Right. The phrase I often use is, we don't win on the strength of our argument. We win on the strength of our relationship.
Oh, that's so good. Say that again.
We don't win on the strength of our argument. All the evidence that our child is ill, we don't win on the strength of that argument. We win on the strength of our relationship with them. And let me just say one very common sense thing that I think is important to say. When someone has their first episode, of course you should talk to them about having an illness and needing treatment. Of course you should be educational.
That's a really good point. You're talking about first episode.
Because 50% will come to understand they're ill. It may take a few months, but they will come to understand they're ill, right? But if you're in a situation where for a year, 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years, you're hitting that brick wall, it's time to surrender and join the winning side. And the winning side is your child's experience and how they see the world. Not that you're going to lie. You don't lie and say, I believe the things you believe. But you respect them. So let me see if I understand. This is what's going on. Okay, now do I understand correctly? You reflect it back actively. How do you feel about it? I'm scared out of my mind. I can't sleep. I'd be scared too. Well, do you believe me? Then we would delay giving our opinion. Promise I'll answer that question. Before I do, can you tell me when you first noticed this happening, or something like that? Would that be okay? We ask permission. And then eventually we do give our opinion. I'm sorry, I could be wrong. I don't see the same thing you see, but I don't want to argue about this. So I just went through 5 of the tools very quickly. It doesn't take longer, but it does take practice. It does take practice.
So what about a situation where some of these parents have children who can become violent, either violent in their anger, violent in their delusions, violent in their frustration? So abusive maybe in their speech, maybe they're incredibly either disrespectful or literally abusive in their speech and in behavior, all the way to different levels of violence in their illness. How does this work? How does this approach help when in the face of those situations?
I'm going to address 2 scenarios. When someone's being verbally abusive, the best way to calm someone down is to reflectively listen to them. So you're saying, I'm this, I'm that, we can think of all the horrible epitaphs. Is that what you're saying? Do I understand that? that actually calms people down typically. When we teach law enforcement this approach, and we have hostage negotiators in the room, this has happened a half dozen times over the last 20 years. I'll get someone to come up and say, that's the very first thing we learned when we were learning to be hostage negotiators. Ask the person what's going on, no matter how angry they are, and then reflect it back. Now, when someone's actually violent, there's only one thing to do, which is to call a crisis team or call the police.
Okay.
Make sure the police know that if there's no weapon, there's no weapon. My son or daughter's seriously mentally ill, so that they understand they're not coming to a home that's harboring a criminal. They're coming to a home which has been devastated by mental illness. Very different.
I'm sorry, finish what you were saying.
There's very different scenarios, and police officers who I really respect and appreciate what they do need to know that information to come prepared.
Absolutely, because it can turn into a tragedy very quickly. Otherwise, so let's just say a teenager, so particularly an adolescent, is getting a little mouthy and moving beyond mouthy to kind of, maybe as you indicated, like screaming, accusations or ugly words and other things. So I think the question comes from many parents is, how boundaries of, sorry, you can't do that in our home, or you can't talk to me that way, or you can't talk to your brother and sister that way, or, I heard you talk about use some reflective listening and, calling out their feelings and their responses.
Right.
You kind of get where I'm going.
You got to set boundaries. You got to take care of yourself. It's the old oxygen mask analogy. When you're on an airplane, you put your mask on first. So you got to protect yourself before you can help anybody else. So you set boundaries calmly. There's a lot of research on how intense emotion actually makes symptoms worse in people with serious mental illness. So raising your voice is not going to help things. Common sense stuff, but there's actually a lot of research on it. Calmly saying, look, I'm really sorry, you can't talk to me this way. I'm not going to allow it. Now, how do you enforce that? Depends on the situation. There's so many scenarios I can think of, but essentially, if you can remove your loved one from the situation, ask them to go to their room, or you can leave, go. If it's a telephone call, you say, I'm really sorry, but I'm going to hang up. I won't be spoken to this way. I love you, but I'm hanging up, and you hang up. Taking the abuse doesn't help anyone.
Okay, that's good, because I think sometimes we swing from one pendulum to the other. If I've been really strong over here on, boundaries, and you're ill and you need to acknowledge it. And, and then it's over this, I need to empathize with your feelings that I'm a, SOB or whatever, I'm going to empathize with your feelings and to find where that pendulum needs to rest for safety for other people in the home, particularly young siblings. To not
be abused, the approach that I teach is not one that, turns you into a pincushion or someone who, that's not at all what it's about. You have to set boundaries.
What about other family members, extended family, or even in a couple? I can imagine some of the couples that are watching are already reacting completely differently to this information.
Oh yeah.
And so they're going to get off this call, and there could be some heated conversations about, well, that doesn't make sense to me, or I can't do that, or I'm not going to go that direction. I'm not going to let him say this, or I'm not going to let her do that, or I'm tired of this, whatever. So how do we both as couples maybe come together around this, or maybe we're together in our approach, but other family members, grandparents, aunt, uncles who are in our teachers,
right.
Coach, how do we help other people respond to our loved ones with some of the things that we have found to be much more effective?
Well, this is one of the reasons I very quickly brought up that symptom of anosognosia. If you can help somebody understand that your loved one is not being a pain in the butt, is not being difficult, is not being disrespectful, that they're suffering from a brain disorder, and that's what's rendering them unable to see they're ill and making them combative verbally. If you can really understand that, it changes everything. So there's a TEDx talk on our website. It's 18 minutes. We've gotten such wonderful feedback that was very transformative for people. So we have a mother who gets it, who wants to try this approach, and the father says he just needs to grow up. He needs to respect us. I mean, I hate to be sexist on it, but it's often the husbands that are having a hard time with this approach at first, in my experience. So, looking at that information is a really useful tool. It's a free video. It's on the website. And like I said, we get a lot of feedback from people thanking us that was really helpful, that really turned them around. Same thing with extended family. You can ask them to read 7 of the chapters of my book, I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help. Oh, there it is.
Great book.
Thank you.
Awesome book. Awesome. You have to get this as a game-changing book, you guys. Keep going.
Well, there's some free chapters on the NAMI website, NAMI.org. So you don't have to even buy the book. Read chapter 3. It's all about anosognosia. That helps. But much easier than that is just go to the TED Talk and on leapinstitute.org is the website. And
you also have some free trainings for clinicians, but also for family members or parents, right? That they can access on your website. You guys, the videos on Dr. Amador's website are powerful. They take everything that we've been talking about, and you'll see him role playing it with people. You'll just hear lots of it's an invaluable resource, his website, his book, his trainings. And what you have shared is just so powerful and profound. I was rereading the book again, just freshening my mind again with and my copy is highlighted and underlined, and I've got little comments off to the side because it is so practical. I really believe that the LEAP approach is not only a way to transform your relationship with your loved one who has a mental illness. I think it would transform just about every relationship we have, because the principles of humility, of not feeling like you know everything, or that to be able to say those words, well, I could be wrong. Those words don't always come easily out of our mouths in any relationship. Right. But that humility, that curiosity of, well, what is it that you're saying to me? Oh, that's what you're saying. Is that what you're saying? And, oh, I would feel that way too. That empathy of, I would feel that, listening and being empathetic and agreeing to disagree. And finding the places where there is harmony. It's not just, okay, I'm going to get really crazy here, but it's not just about this. It would transform a society. It would transform families and neighborhoods and society. What if we treated each other with that kind of respect and humility and empathy and kindness? So whether you have a loved one who has a mental illness or not, this book is amazing, and the principles are far-reaching. They have staying power, I think. In our
I think it's a fundamental truth that we all want to be heard and understood. It's a fundamental truth. And when we can do that for our loved ones, a lot can happen.
Absolutely. It's so good. So as we close this time, thank you for being with us. Thank you for sharing your story and sharing Henry's story. And it is a sweet story. I'm so glad you shared it. But what can you, just as we close this, what hope do you want to offer to these moms and dads who are listening?
I have a lot of hope, because I've seen it work. I've seen it happen. When people make that shift from trying to educate to understand and validate and appreciate their loved ones' experience. So I've seen, here's the thing, if you understand the nature of the problem, you actually can then utilize tools to address that problem. The problem isn't that your child is being difficult, stubborn, immature, or in denial. It's another symptom of the brain disorder. And so I have a tremendous amount of hope. I've seen that when you make that shift and you understand that that's the nature of the problem, then you can apply these tools we've been talking about. And people get better and they get into treatment, just like my brother did. He never believed he had schizophrenia, by the way. Never believed it. Let's not forget that. stayed in treatment for the rest of his life. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Amador.
You're
Always a
welcome.
pleasure to talk to you, and look
Likewise.
forward to that third time where we hear how you ended up in Ohio instead of Florida when you left Cuba. Happy New Year to you. It's great
Happy
to
New
be
Year.
with you. Thanks.
Thank you.